Hello and welcome back, dear Librophiles. I am Vexing Cat. If this is your first time checking me out, but I am a classic literature reader, primarily. I don't know. I'm just scuffing this from the get-go. Hey, welcome to my library. If this is your first visit, this is Vexing Cat, retro tiger librarian. I read classic literature, poetry, and occasionally play games. Feel free, get settled, um, hydrate, caffeinate, grab a snack, do whatever it is that you need to do to get comfortable. And if you need to take a break, don't hesitate to use the exclamation lurk. And I appreciate you stopping by, however long that you decide to listen. Currently, I am reading, as you can see, Anne of Green Gables, which is from Lucy Maud Montgomery, a Canadian author. Uh, Last week we read two chapters, chapter 1 and chapter 2, and we will be continuing on with chapter 3. Water, caffeine, snack. Okay, I've got everything I need. I will, however, open my caffeine. Woo! A little can opening ASMR for you. Okay. Woo! Okay. So we return to Anne of Green Gables, chapter 3. Marilla Cuthbert is surprised. Oh, before I forget, Benito Sarino. No, I can't say that I have Magatra. I cannot say that I have. Though if it is anything that is not Mugworks, I'll have to, or Mur. No, Moo? Mugworks or Moo? No, I don't think so. If they're not copyright infringement, I might have to check them out. I was just looking up James and the Giant Peach, which, due to 1978 copyright laws, I can't read anything. Well, I'm going to have to look a little bit deeper into it. Right now, I don't read anything that is not at least 95 years after an author's death, which is why James the Giant Peach won't be available to me until 1961. However, if it was under the 1976 copyright laws, it would have been available 7 years ago. So, slightly frustrated. But, I've noticed that some of the other live readers kind of can read whatever they want, so I'm going to find out a Herman Melville book. I'm gonna have to find out, like, if it's like under a specific library license in which they are reading, or if it's under their public library card, book withdrawal. Herman Melville should be okay. I'll write that down. We'll just pin that for now. Have to check that out a little bit later. So, chapter 3, Marilla Cuthbert is surprised. Marilla came briskly forward as Matthew opened the door. But when her eyes fell on the odd little figure in the stiff, ugly dress, with the long braids of red hair and eager, luminous eyes, she stopped short in amazement. Matthew Cuthbert, who's that? She ejaculated. Where is the boy? There wasn't any boy, said Matthew wretchedly. There was only her. He nodded at the child, remembering that he had never even asked her name. No boy, but there must have been a boy, insisted Marilla. We sent word to Mrs. Spencer to bring a boy. Well, she didn't. She brought her. I asked the station master and I had to bring her home. She couldn't be left there, no matter where the mistake had come in. Well, this is a pretty piece of business, ejaculated Marilla. During this dialogue, the child had remained silent, her eyes roving from one to the other, all the animation fading out of her face. Suddenly, she seemed to grasp the full meaning of what had been said. Dropping her precious carpet bag, she sprang forward a step and clasped her hands. "You don't want me?" she cried. "You don't want me because I'm not a boy. I might have expected it. Nobody ever did want me. I might have known it was all too beautiful to last. I might have known nobody really did want me. Oh, what shall I do? I'm going to burst into tears." Burst into tears she did, sitting down on a chair by the table, flinging her arms out upon it and burying her face in them. She proceeded to cry stormily. Marilla and Matthew looked at each other deprecatingly across the stove. Neither of them knew what to say or do. Finally, Marilla stepped lamely into the breach. "Well, there's no need to cry so about it." "Yes, there is need." The child raised her head quickly, revealing a tear-stained face and trembling lips. "You would cry too if you were an orphan and had come to a place you thought was going to be home and found that they didn't want you because you weren't a boy. Oh, this is the most tragical thing that ever happened to me." Thank you, Higara. Thank you for the gifted sub. Nikarem, if you're watching, please enjoy the emotes. Something like a reluctant smile, rather rusty from long disuse, mellowed Marilla's grim expression. "Well, don't cry any more. We're not going to turn you out of doors tonight. You'll have to stay here until we investigate this affair. What's your name?" The child hesitated for a moment. "Will you please call me Cordelia?" she said eagerly. "Call you Cordelia? Is that your name?" "No, it's not exactly my name, but I would love to be called Cordelia. It's such a perfectly elegant name." "I don't know what on earth you mean. If Cordelia isn't your name, what is?" "Anne Shirley," reluctantly faltered forth the owner of that name. "But oh, please do call me Cordelia. It can't matter much to you what you call me if I'm only going to be here a little while, can it? And Anne is such an unromantic name." "Unromantic fiddlesticks," said the unsympathetic Marilla. "Anne is a real good, plain, sensible name. You've no need to be ashamed of it." "Oh, I'm not ashamed of it," explained Anne. "Only I like Cordelia better. I've always imagined that my name was Cordelia. At least I always have of late years. When I was young, I used to imagine it was Geraldine. But I like Cordelia better now. But if you call me Anne, please call me Anne spelled with an E." "What difference does it make how it's spelled?" asked Marilla with another rusty smile as she picked up the teapot. "Oh, it makes such a difference. It looks so much nicer. When you hear a name pronounced, can't you always see it in your mind, just as if it was printed out? I can. And ANN looks dreadful, but ANNE looks so much more distinguished. If you'll only call me Anne, spell it with an E. I shall try to reconcile myself to not being called Cordelia." "Very well then, Anne, spelled with an E. Can you tell us how this mistake came to be made? We sent word to Mrs. Spencer to bring us a boy. Were there no boys at the asylum?" "Oh, yes, there was an abundance of them, but Mrs. Spencer said distinctly that you wanted a girl about 11 years old, and the matron said she thought I would do. You don't know how delighted I was. I couldn't sleep all last night for joy." "Oh," she added reproachfully, turning to Matthew, "why didn't you tell me at the station that you didn't want me and leave me there? If I hadn't seen the white way of delight and the lake of shining waters, it wouldn't be so hard." What on earth does she mean? Demanded Marilla, staring at Matthew. She's just referring to some conversation we had on the road, said Matthew hastily. I'm going out to put the mare in, Marilla. Have tea ready when I come back. Did Mrs. Spencer bring anybody over besides you? Continued Marilla when Matthew had gone out. She brought Lily Jones for herself. Lily is only 5 years old, and she is very beautiful. She has nut brown hair. If I was very beautiful and had nut brown hair, would you keep me? No. We want a boy to help Matthew on the farm. A girl would be of no use to us. Take off your hat. I'll lay it it lay I'll lay it and your bag on the hall table. Anne took off her hat meekly. Matthew came back presently, and they sat down to supper. But Anne could not eat. In vain she nibbled at the bread and butter and pecked at the crab-apple preserve out of the little scalloped glass dish by her plate. She did not really make any headway at all. You're not eating anything, said Marilla sharply, eyeing her as if it were a serious shortcoming. Anne sighed. I can't. I'm in the depths of despair. Can you eat when you are in the depths of despair? I've never been in the depths of despair, so I can't say, responded Marilla. Weren't you? Well, did you ever try to imagine you were in the depths of despair? No, I didn't. Then I don't think you can understand what it's like. It's a very uncomfortable feeling indeed when you try to eat. A lump comes right up in your throat, and you can't swallow anything, not even if it was chocolate caramel. I had one chocolate caramel once 2 years ago, and it was simply delicious. I've often dreamed since then I've often dreamed since then that I had a lot of chocolate caramels, but I always wake up just when I'm going to eat them. I do hope you won't be offended because I can't eat. Everything is extremely nice, but still I cannot eat. I guess she's tired, said Matthew, who hadn't spoken since his return from the barn. Best put her to bed, Marilla. Marilla had been wondering where Anne should be put to bed. She had prepared a couch in the kitchen chamber for the desired and expected boy. But, although it was neat and clean, it did not seem quite the thing to put a girl there somehow. But the spare room was out of the question for such a stray waif, so there remained only the east gable room. Marilla lighted a candle and told Anne to follow her, which Anne spiritlessly did, taking her hat and carpet-bag from the hall table as she passed. The hall was fearsomely clean. The little gable chamber in which she presently found herself seemed still cleaner. Marilla set the candle on a three-legged, three-cornered table and turned down the bedclothes. I suppose you have a nightgown. Close that. She questioned. Anne nodded. Yes, I have two. The matron of the asylum made them for me. They're fearfully skimpy. There is never enough to go around in an asylum, so things are always skimpy, at least in a poor asylum like ours. I hate skimpy night dresses, but one can dream just as well in them as in lovely trailing ones with frills around the neck. That's one consolation. Well, undress as quick as you can and go to bed. I'll come back in a few minutes for the candle. I daren't trust you to put it out yourself. You'd likely set the place on fire. Mind you, this is an 11-year-old girl who seems clearly very capable, and left to her own devices at a station, I highly doubt that she would light the house on fire with a candle. That's preposterous. When Marilla had gone, Anne looked around her wistfully. The whitewashed walls were so painfully bare and staring that she thought they must ache over their own bareness. The floor was bare, too, except for a round, braided mat in the middle, such as Anne had never seen before. In one corner was the bed, a high, old-fashioned one with four dark, low-turned posts. In the other corner was the aforesaid three-cornered table adorned with a fat, red velvet pincushion, hard enough to turn the point of the most adventurous pen. Above it hung a little 6 by 8 mirror. Midway between table and bed was the window, with an icy white muslin frill over it, and opposite was the washstand. And opposite it was, phrasing there, and opposite it was the washstand. The whole apartment was of a rigidity not to be described in words, but which sent a shiver to the very marrow of Anne's bones. With a sob, she hastily discarded her garments, put on the skimpy nightgown, and sprang into bed, where she burrowed her face downward into the pillow and pulled the clothes over her head. For context, in modern terms, skimpy means something very different than skimpy did during, what was this, 1907? So, skimpy then just meant like possibly threadbare or of poor quality or without frills. So, very simple. So, probably just straight at the shoulders, straight down, and just like a tube. Very, very unexciting bedclothes, which is good. When Marilla came up for the light, various skimpy articles of raiment scattered most untidily over the floor, and a certain tempestuous appearance of the bed were the only indications of any presence save her own. She deliberately picked up Anne's clothes, placed them neatly on a prim yellow chair, and then, taking up the candle, went over to the bed. "Good night," she said, a little awkwardly, but not unkindly. Anne's white face and big eyes appeared over the bedclothes with a startling suddenness. "How can you call it a good night when you know it must be the very worst night I've ever had?" she said reproachfully. Then she dived down into invisibility again. Marilla went slowly down to the kitchen and proceeded to wash the supper dishes. Matthew was smoking, a sure sign of perturbation. Perturbation? Yeah, perturbation. I'm perturbed, obviously, but perturbation. That's an interesting new word. Let's see here. Grab that, open that. Helps if you actually type it in there. Perturbation. Maybe? Pronunciation here. Yep, perturbation. Okay. The act of perturbing, the state of being perturbed, mental disquiet, disturbance or agitation. A cause of mental disquiet, disturbance, or agitation. Oh, in astronomy. Deviation of a celestial body from a regular orbit about its primary, caused by the presence of one or more other bodies that act upon the celestial body. That's some good phrasing. Anyway, but I'm guessing mental disquiet. And the situation with Anne is the cause of the mental disquiet. The more you know. He seldom smoked, for Marilla set her face against it as a filthy habit. But at certain times and seasons he felt driven to it, and then Marilla winked at the practice, realizing that a mere man must have some vent for his emotions. "Well, this is a pretty kettle of fish," she said wrathfully. "This is what comes of sending word instead of going ourselves. Robert Spencer's folks have twisted that message somehow. One of us will have to drive over and see Mrs. Spencer tomorrow. That's certain. This girl will have to be sent back to the asylum." "Yes, I suppose so," said Matthew reluctantly. "You suppose so? Don't you know it? Well, now, she's a real nice little thing, Marilla. It's kind of a pity to send her back when she's so set on staying here. Matthew Cuthbert, you don't mean to say you think we ought to keep her. Marilla's astonishment could not have been greater if Matthew had expressed a predilection for standing on his head. Well, now, no, I suppose not. Not exactly, stammered Matthew, uncomfortably driven into a corner for his precise meaning. I suppose we could hardly be expected to keep her. I should say not. What good would she be to us? We might be some good to her, said Matthew, suddenly and unexpectedly. Matthew Cuthbert, I believe that child has bewitched you. I can see as plain that you want to keep her. Well, now, she's a real interesting little thing, persisted Matthew. You should have heard her talk coming from the station. Oh, she can talk fast enough. I saw that at once. It's nothing in her favor either. I don't like children who have so much to say. I don't want an orphan girl, and if I did, she isn't the style I'd pick out. There's something I don't understand about her. No, she's got to be dispatched straight away back to where she came from. I could hire a French boy to help me, said Matthew, and she'd be company for you. I'm not suffering for company, said Marilla shortly, and I'm not going to keep her. Well, now, it's just as you say, of course, Marilla, said Matthew, rising and putting his pipe away. I'm going to bed. To bed went Matthew, and to bed when she had put her dishes away went Marilla, frowning most resolutely, and upstairs in the east gable a lonely, heart-hungry, and friendless child cried herself to sleep. Poor Anne. Poor Cordelia! I can understand. That's a pretty fancy name. I want to be called Cordelia. Is that not your name? No? No, it isn't. It's Anne Shirley. Oh man, poor Anne. We are between chapters, so as a friendly reminder, please hydrate, caffeinate, grab a snack, do whatever it is you need to get settled and be comfortable. I'm gonna do a little stretch. Ooh. All right then. All of the popping. Okay. I've stretched my poor old bones. All right, we are on to chapter 4. Morning at Green Gables. It was broad daylight when Anne awoke and sat up in bed, staring confusedly at the window through which a flood of cheery sunshine was pouring, and outside of which something white and feathery waved across glimpses of blue sky. For a moment, she could not remember where she was. First came a delightful thrill, as if something very pleasant, then a horrible remembrance. This was Green Gables, and they didn't want her because she wasn't a boy. Out of hot chips. Oh no! That doesn't sound good at all. Also, welcome in, Teeth. It's been a minute. But it was morning, and yes, it was a cherry tree in full bloom outside of her window. With a bound, she was out of bed and across the floor. She pushed up the sash. It went up stiffly and creakily, as if it hadn't been opened for a long time. Which was the case. And it stuck so tight that nothing was needed to hold it up. Anne dropped on her knees and gazed out into the June morning, her eyes glistening with delight. Oh, wasn't it beautiful? Wasn't it a lovely place? Suppose she wasn't really going to stay here. She would imagine she was. There was a scope for imagination here. A huge cherry tree grew outside so close that its boughs tapped against the house, and it was so thick set with blossoms that hardly a leaf was to be seen. On both sides of the house was a big orchard, one of green apples and one of cherry trees, also showered over with blossoms, and their grass was all sprinkled with dandelions. Great first pollinators for bees. If you can leave your dandelions alone, I would recommend it. They're great for bees. In the garden below were lilac trees, purple with flowers, and their dizzy, sweet fragrance drifted up to the window on the morning wind. Below the garden, a green field lush with clover sloped down to the hollow where the brook ran and where scores of white birches grew, upspringing airily out of an undergrowth suggestive of delightful possibilities in ferns and mosses and woodsy things generally. You know, Lucy, your prose is just delightful. It's like saltwater taffy, just slowly melting on your tongue. It's delightful. Beyond it was a hill, green and feathery with spruce and fir. There was a gap in it where the gray gable ends of the little house she had seen from the other side of the lake of shining waters was visible. Off to the left were the big barns, and beyond them, away down over green, low-sloping fields, was a sparkling blue glimpse of sea. Anne's beauty-loving eyes lingered on it all, taking everything greedily in. She had looked on so many unlovely places in her life. Poor child. But this was as lovely as anything she had ever dreamed. Me too. She knelt there, lost to everything but the loveliness around her, until she was startled by a hand on her shoulder. Marilla had come in, unheard by the small dreamer. It's time you were dressed," she said curtly. Marilla really did not know how to talk to the child, and her uncomfortable ignorance made her crisp and curt when she did not mean to be. Anne stood up and drew a long breath. "Oh, isn't it wonderful?" she said, waving her hand comprehensively at the good world outside. "It's a big tree," said Marilla, "and it blooms great, but the fruit don't amount to much, never. Small and wormy. Oh, I don't mean just the tree, of course. It's lovely, but yes, it's radiantly lovely. It blooms as if it meant it. But I meant everything. The garden and the orchard and the brook and the woods, the whole big dear world. Don't you feel as if you just loved the world on a morning like this? And I can hear the brook laughing all the way up here. Have you ever noticed what cheerful things brooks are? They're always laughing. Even in winter time, I've heard them under the ice. I'm so glad there's a brook near Green Gables. Perhaps you think it doesn't make any difference to me when you're not going to keep me, but it does. I shall always like to remember that there is a brook at Green Gables, even if I never see it again. If there wasn't a brook, I'd be haunted by the uncomfortable feeling that there ought to be one. I'm not in the depths of despair this morning. I never can be in the morning. Isn't it a splendid thing that there are mornings? But I feel very sad." "She is a morning person. Beware." I'm just I've just been imagining that it was really me you wanted after all, and that I was to stay here forever and ever. It was a great comfort while it lasted. But the worst of imagining things is that the time comes when you have to stop, and that hurts. "You'd better get dressed and come downstairs, and never mind your imaginings," said Marilla as soon as she could get a word in edgewise. Breakfast is waiting. Wash your face and comb your hair. Leave the window up and turn your bedclothes back over the foot of the bed. Be as smart as you can. Anne could evidently be smart to some purpose, for she was downstairs in 10 minutes' time, with her clothes neatly on, her hair brushed and braided, her face washed, and a comfortable consciousness pervading her soul that she had fulfilled all Marilla's requirements. As a matter of fact, however, she had forgotten to turn back the bedclothes. "I'm pretty hungry this morning," she announced, as she slipped into the chair Marilla placed for her. "The world doesn't seem such a howling wilderness as it did last night. I'm so glad it's a sunshiny morning, but I like rainy mornings real well, too. All sorts of mornings are interesting, don't you think? You don't know what's going to happen through the day, and there's so much scope for imagination. But I'm glad it's not rainy today, because it's easier to be cheerful and bear up under affliction on a sunshiny day. I feel that I have a good deal to bear up under. It's all very well to read about sorrows and imagine yourself living through them heroically, but it's not so nice when you really come to have them, is it?" "For pity's sake, hold your tongue," said Marilla. "You talk entirely too much for a little girl." Thereupon Anne held her tongue so obediently and thoroughly that her continued silence made Marilla rather nervous, as if in the presence of something not exactly natural. Matthew also held his tongue, but this at least was natural, so that the meal was a very silent one. As it progressed, Anne became more and more abstracted, eating mechanically, with her big eyes fixed unswervingly and unseeingly on the sky outside the window. This made Marilla more nervous than ever. She had an uncomfortable feeling that while this odd child's body might be there at the table, her spirit was far away in some remote, airy cloudland, borne aloft on the wings of imagination. Who would want such a child about the place? Yet Matthew wished to keep her, for all unaccountable things. Of all unaccountable things, Marilla felt that he wanted it just as much this morning as he had the night before, and that he would go on wanting it. That was Matthew's way. Take a whim into his head and cling to it with the most amazing silent persistency. A persistency 10 times more potent and effectual in its very silence than if he had talked it out. When the meal was ended, Anne came out of her reverie and offered to wash the dishes. "Can you wash dishes right?" asked Marilla distrustfully. "Pretty well. I'm better at looking after children, though. I've had so much experience at that. It's such a pity you haven't any here for me to look after. I don't feel as if I wanted any more children to look after than I've got at present. You're problem enough in all conscience. What's to be done with you, I don't know. Matthew is a most ridiculous man." I think he's lovely," said Anne reproachfully. "He is so very sympathetic. He didn't mind how much I talked. He seemed to like it. I felt that he was a kindred spirit as soon as ever I saw him." "You're both queer enough, if that's what you mean by kindred spirits," said Marilla with a sniff. "Yes, you may wash the dishes. Take plenty of hot water and be sure you dry them well. I've got enough to attend to this morning, for I'll have to drive over to White Sands in the afternoon and see Mrs. Spencer. You'll come with me and we'll settle what's to be done with you. After you finish the dishes, go upstairs and make your bed." Anne washed the dishes deftly enough, as Marilla, who kept a sharp eye on the process, discerned. Later on she made her bed less successfully, for she had never learned the art of wrestling with a feather tick. But it was done somehow and smoothed down, and then Marilla, to get rid of her, told her she might go out of doors and amuse herself until dinner time. Anne flew to the door, face alight, eyes glowing. On the very threshold she stopped short, wheeled about, came back, and sat down by the table. Light and glow as effectually blotted out as if someone had clapped an extinguisher on her. "What's the matter now?" demanded Marilla. "I don't dare go out," said Anne, in the tone of a martyr relinquishing all earthly joys. "If I can't stay here, There is no use in my loving Green Gables. And if I go out there and get acquainted with all those trees and flowers and the orchard and the brook, I'll not be able to help loving it. It's hard enough now. So I won't make it any harder. I want to go out so much. Everything seems to be calling to me, Anne, come out to us. Anne, we want a playmate, better but it's better not. There is no use in loving things if you have to be torn from them, is there? And it's so hard to keep from loving things, isn't it? That was why I was so glad when I thought I was going to live here. I thought I'd have so many things to love and nothing to hinder me, but that brief dream is over. I'm resigned to my fate now. So I don't think I'll go out for fear I'll get unresigned again. What is the name of that geranium on the windowsill, please? That's the apple-scented geranium. Welcome in, Apis. Mr. Bear, it's always lovely to have you. Oh, I don't mean that sort of name. I mean just a name you gave it yourself. Didn't you give it a name? May I give it one then? May I call it, let me see. Bonnie would do. May I call it Bonnie while I'm here? Oh, do let me. Goodness, I don't care. But where on earth is the sense of naming? But where on earth is the sense of naming a geranium? Oh, I like things to have handles, even if they are only geraniums. It makes them seem more like people. How do you know but that it hurts a geranium's feelings just to be called a geranium and nothing else? You wouldn't like to be called nothing but a woman all the time. Yes, I shall call it Bonnie. I named that cherry tree outside my bedroom window this morning. I call it Snow Queen because it was so white. Of course it won't always be in blossom, but one can imagine that it is, can't one? I never in all my life saw or heard anything to equal her, muttered Marilla, beating a retreat down cellar after potatoes. She is kind of interesting, as Matthew says. I can feel already that I'm wondering what on earth she'll say next. She'll be casting a spell over me too. She's cast it over Matthew. That look he gave me when he went out said everything he said or hinted last night over again. I wish he was like other men and would talk things out. A body could answer back then and argue him into reason, but what's to be done with a man who just looks? Anne had relapsed into reverie, with her chin in her hands and her eyes on the sky when Marilla returned from her cellar pilgrimage. There Marilla left her until the early dinner was on the table. I suppose I can have the mare and buggy this afternoon, Matthew, said Marilla. Matthew nodded and looked wistfully at Anne. Marilla intercepted the look and said grimly, I'm going to drive over to White Sands and settle this thing. I'll take Anne with me, and Mrs. Spencer will probably make arrangements to send her back to Nova Scotia at once. I'll set your tea out for you, and I'll be home in time to milk the cows. Still, Matthew said nothing, and Marilla had a sense of having wasted words and breath. There's nothing more aggravating than a man who won't talk back, unless it is a woman who won't. What? There is nothing more aggravating than a man who won't talk back, unless it is a woman who won't. Interesting. Matthew hitched the sorrel into the buggy in due time, and Marilla and Anne set off. Matthew opened the yard gate for them, and as they drove slowly through, he said, to nobody in particular, as it seemed, Little Jerry Buote from the creek was here this morning. I told him I guessed I'd hire him for the summer. Marilla made no reply, but she hit the unlucky sorrel such a vicious clip with the whip that the fat mare, unused to such treatment, whizzed indignantly down the lane at an alarming pace. Marilla looked back once at the buggy as the buggy bounced along and saw the aggravating Matthew leaning over the gate, looking wistfully after them. Dun dun dun. All right. I think we have time for one more chapter before the ad break. As a friendly reminder, hydrate, caffeinate, grab a snack. Me too.
Drink water.
You got it.
Become moist.
Num 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 num. All of the water. Hydration. Yes. So, yes, we'll go ahead and read chapter 5 and then thank you for the lurk, Tiger Faye. Tiger Faye has wandered into the Do Not Disturb section of the library. We hope you enjoy the ambiance in the meantime. Thank you for lurking. Maybe that would be, I should write that down. That would be a good, like, physical alert. So, in the works, I have a number of different things kind of cooking. I've got a whole slew of consistent emotes done by one artist. I believe their name is Yuki Ann. I would have to look on VGen for that, but where is a pen when you need one? Ah, there we go. All right. So, hydration, alert, maybe a lurk, alert. I'll have to figure out what these will be. Snack. I think I've got that one already unlocked. I do want a lurk emote. That might be something I'll get in a couple months. Okay. I have a couple of different things in the works. New emotes, new alerts coming. I need to work with another artist to get another, well, not another artist, but specifically the Dark Tune to finish a another pinup style. Right now, they are doing Fallout reference artwork, which is really amazing. If you haven't seen, it's fantastic. One of these days, I'm gonna have to get something made by Tiger Faye too. Their artwork is so cute, and I really like. They have this head patting alert that it's like pat 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 pat, you know, like rubbing their head. And I've seen a lot of them where it's just like the same hand, but Tiger Faye has their paw rubbing the top of their head, and I just love it. Um, Absolutely great. Anyway, I digress. I have gone completely off subject. We're here to read Chapter 5, Anne's History. Do you know, said Anne confidently, I've made up my mind to enjoy this drive. It's been my experience that you can nearly always enjoy things if you make up your mind firmly that you will. Of course, you must make it up firmly. I am not going to think about going back to the asylum while we're having our drive. I'm just going to think about the drive. Oh, look, there's one little early wild rose out. Isn't it lovely? Don't you think it must be glad to be a rose? Wouldn't it be nice if roses could talk? I'm sure they would tell us I'm sure they would tell us such lovely things, and isn't pink the most bewitching color in the world? I love it, but I can't wear it. Me too, Anne, me too. Red-headed people can't wear pink, not even in imagination. Did you ever know of anybody whose hair was red when she was young, but got to be another color when she grew up? Oh, pardon me. No, I don't know as I ever did, said Marilla mercilessly. I shouldn't think it likely to happen in your case either. Anne sighed. Well, that is another hope gone. My life is a perfect graveyard of buried hopes. That's a sentence I read in a book once, and I say it over to comfort myself whenever I'm disappointed in anything. I don't see where the comforting comes in myself, said Marilla. Why, because it sounds so nice and romantic. just as if I were a heroine in a book, you know. I am so fond of romantic things, and a graveyard full of buried hopes is about as romantic a thing as one can imagine, isn't it? I'm rather glad I have one. Are we going to are we going across the lake of shining waters today? We're not going over Barry's Pond, if that's what you mean by your lake of shining waters. We're going by the shore road. Shore road sounds nice, said Anne dreamily. Is it as nice as it sounds? Just when you said shore road, I saw it in a picture in my mind, as quick as that. And White Sands is a pretty name, too. But I don't like it as well as Avonlea. Avonlea is a lovely name. It just sounds like music. How far is it to White Sands? It's 5 miles, and as you're evidently bent on talking, you might as well talk to some purpose by telling me what you know about yourself. Oh, what I know about myself isn't really worth telling, said Anne eagerly. If you'll only let me tell you what I imagine about myself, you'll think it ever so much more interesting. No, I don't want any of your imaginings, just you stick to bald facts. Begin at the beginning. Where were you born, and how old are you? I was 11 last March, said Anne, resigning herself to bald facts with a little sigh, and I was born in Bolingbroke, Nova Scotia. My father's name was Walter Shirley, and he was a teacher in the Bolingbroke High School. My mother's name was Bertha Shirley. Aren't Walter and Bertha lovely names? I'm so glad my parents had nice names. It would be a real disgrace to have a father named, well, say, Jedediah, wouldn't it? I guess it doesn't matter what a person's name is as long as he behaves himself, said Marilla, feeling herself called upon to inculate. Inculate, ooh, that's a good word. Let's see, inculate. Inculate. Did I misspell it? Inculcate. Oh, okay. Verb. To implant by repeated statement or admonition. Teach persistently and earnestly, usually followed by upon or in. Ingrain, infix, instill, to cause or influence someone to accept an idea or feeling, usually followed by with. Inculcate. Okay, said Marilla, feeling herself called upon to inculcate a good and useful moral. Well, I don't know. Anne looked thoughtful. I read in a book once that a rose by any other name would smell as sweet, but I've never been able to believe it. I don't believe a rose would be as nice if it was called a thistle or a skunk cabbage. Side note, recently learned through a science journal, the common thistle has found to have a nerve regenerative effect. And I find that incredibly fascinating, and I'm very excited to see um, how they can develop that scientifically, genetically through the thistle to be able to restore nerves. Ah, just fascinating. I suppose my father could have been a good man, even if he had been called Jedediah, but I'm sure it would have been a cross. Well, my mother was a teacher in the high school tool. Yeah, in the high school tool. Tool. I don't know why I'm saying tool. In the high school too. But when she married father, she gave up teaching, of course. A husband was enough responsibility. Mrs. Thomas said that they were a pair of babies and as poor as church mice. They went to live in a weeny teeny little yellow house in Bolingbroke. I've never seen that house, but I've imagined it thousands of times. I think it must have had honeysuckle over the parlor window and lilacs in the front yard and lilies of the valley just inside the gate. Yes, and muslin curtains in all the windows. Muslin curtains give a house such an air. I was born in that house. Mrs. Thomas said I was the homeliest baby she ever saw. I was so scrawny and tiny and nothing but eyes. But that mother thought I was perfectly beautiful. I should think a mother would be a better judge than a poor woman who came in to scrub, wouldn't you? I'm glad she who came in I'm glad she was satisfied with me anyhow. I would feel so sad if I thought I was a disappointment to her, because she didn't live very long after that, you see. She died of fever when I was just 3 months old. I do wish she'd lived long enough for me to remember calling her mother. I think it would be so sweet to say mother, wouldn't okay. I think it would be so sweet to say mother, don't you? And father died 4 days afterwards from fever too. That left me an orphan, and folks were at their wits' end, so Mrs. Thomas said, what to do with me. You see, nobody wanted me even then. It seems to be my fate. Father and mother had both come from places far away, and it was well known they hadn't any relatives living. Finally, Mrs. Thomas said she'd take me, though she was poor and had a drunken husband. She brought me up by hand. Do you know if there is anything in bringing hmm, do you know if there is anything in being brought up by hand that ought to make people who are brought up that way better than other people? Because whenever I was naughty, Mrs. Thomas would ask me how I could be such a bad girl when she had brought me up by hand, reproachful like. Mr. and Mrs. Thomas moved away from Bolingbroke to Marysville, and I lived with them until I was 8 years old. I helped look after the Thomas children. There were 4 of them younger than me, and I can tell you they took a lot of looking after. Then Mr. Thomas was killed, falling under a train, and his mother offered to take Mrs. Thomas and the children, but she didn't want me. Mrs. Thomas was at her wits' end, so she said what to do with me. Then Mrs. Hammond from up the river came down and said she'd take me, seeing I was handy with children, and I went up the river to live with her in the little clearing among the stumps. It was a very lonesome place. I'm sure I could never have lived there if I hadn't had an imagination. Mr. Hammond worked a little sawmill up there, and Mrs. Hammond had 8 children. I know what their hobby is. She had twins 3 times. I like babies in moderation, but twins 3 times in succession is too much. I told Mrs. Hammond so firmly when the last pair came. I used to get so dreadfully tired carrying them about. I lived upriver with Mrs. Hammond over 2 years, and then Mr. Hammond died and Mrs. Hammond broke up housekeeping. She divided her children among her relatives and went to the States. I had to go to the asylum at Hopeton because nobody would take me. They didn't want me at the asylum, either. They said they were overcrowded as it was, but they had to take me, and I was there for 4 months until Mrs. Spencer came. Anne finished up with another sigh, of relief this time. Evidently, she did not like talking about her experiences in a world that had not wanted her. Did you ever go to the school? Demanded Marilla, turning the sorrel mare down the shore road. Not a great deal. I went a little the last year I stayed with Mrs. Thomas. When I went upriver, we were so far from a school that I couldn't walk it in winter, and there was vacation in summer, so I could only go in the spring and fall. But of course I went while I was at the asylum. I could read pretty well, and I know ever so many pieces of poetry off by heart. The Battle of Hohenlinden, and Edinburgh after Flodden, and Bingen on the Rhine, and lots of The Lady of the Lake and Most of the Seasons by James Thomson. Don't you just love poetry that gives you a crinkly feeling up and down your back? There's a piece in the Fifth Reader, The Downfall of Poland, that is just full of thrills. Of course I wasn't in the Fifth Reader. I was only in the fourth, but the big girls used to lend me theirs to read. Were those women, Mrs. Thomas and Mrs. Hammond, good to you? Asked Marilla, looking at Anne out of the corner of her eye. Oh, oh, faltered Anne, her sensitive little face suddenly flushed scarlet, and embarrassment sat on her brow. Oh, they meant to be. I know they meant to be just as good and kind as possible, and when people mean to be good to you, you don't mind very much when they're not quite always. They had a good deal to worry then, you know. It's very trying to have a drunken husband, you see, and it must be very trying to have twins 3 times in succession, don't you think? But I feel sure they meant to be good to me. Marilla asked no more questions. Anne gave herself up to the silent rapture over the shore road, and Marilla guided the sorrel abstractedly while she pondered deeply. Pity was suddenly stirring in her heart for the child. What a starved and unloved life she had, of drudgery and poverty and neglect! For Marilla was shrewd enough to read between the lines of Anne's history and divine the truth. No wonder she had been so delighted at the prospect of a real home. It was a pity she had to be sent back. What if she, Marilla, should indulge Matthew's unaccountable whim and let her stay? He was set on it, and the child seemed a nice, teachable little thing. She's got too much to say, thought Marilla, but she might be trained out of that. And there's nothing rude or slangy in what she does say. She's ladylike. It's likely her people were nice folks. The shore road was woodsy and wild and lonesome. On the right hand, scrub firs, their spirits quite unbroken by long years of tussle with the gulf winds, grew thickly. On the left were the steep red sandstone cliffs, so near the track in places that a mare of less steadiness than the sorrel might have tried the nerves of the people behind her. Down at the base of the cliffs were heaps of surf-worn rocks of little sandy coves inlaid with pebble. I'm just running over my words. Slow it down. Down at the base of the cliffs were heaps of surf-worn rocks or little sandy coves inlaid with pebbles as with ocean jewels. Beyond lay the sea, shimmering and blue, and over it soared the gulls, their pinions flashing silvery in the sunlight. Isn't the sea wonderful? Said Anne, rousing from a long, wide-eyed silence. Once, when I lived in Marysville, Mr. Thomas hired an express wagon and took us all to spend the day at the shore 10 miles away. I enjoyed every moment of that day. Even if I had to look after the children all the time, I lived it over in happy dreams for years. But this shore is nicer than the Marysville shore. Aren't those gulls splendid? Would you like to be a gull? I think I would. That is, if I couldn't be a human girl. Don't you think it would be nice to wake up at sunrise and swoop down over the water and away out over the lovely blue all day, and then at night to fly back to one's nest? Oh, I can just imagine myself doing it. What big house is that just ahead, please? That's the White Sands Hotel. Mr. Kirk runs it, but the season hasn't begun yet. There are heaps of Americans come here for the summer. They think this shore is just about right. I was afraid it might be Mrs. Spencer's place, said Anne mournfully. I don't want to get there. Somehow it will seem like the end of everything. Fair, fair, Anne. Okay. We are about an hour in. I'm going to go ahead and run a quick ad break um, and stretch, big stretch. And I will be back very shortly, and that'll give us another full hour of reading time. So hang on to your hats. I will be right back. Oh, the most positive news. I just got a notice from Yuki. Sorry, not Yuki M, Yuki, about my emotes, and they sent me a preview. I'm gonna review all of them, um, and see if there's any changes I want to make um, after stream. But I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm pretty stoked. They look so cute. Yuki's art style too. Can I do I have are they streaming? I think they do. Shoot out. Bear with me a second. Let me grab their. I think they have a Twitch too. I know they have a Twitter. Um, bum ba da ba ba ba. Dee 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 dee. Yes. Um, they are. There we go. Okay, so this. Let me see. So there we go. I don't know what this will show, if it'll show anything at all. If not, ah,
It literally did. What did I do? Look, even that, my food not being British is more British than your accent. And this from a person who lives and born in UK.
yes. Yuki is a Sakura fox goddess VTuber. Um, their website or they've got just the most phenomenal style. Let me pull that up here. Here's their about me. But yeah, look at these little panels. Oh my god, they're so cute. Slay. Slay. Oh my gosh. But yes, fantastic. And they're working on my emotes. I'm so tempted right now to show you guys what they're cooking up, and I'm going to restrain myself. I will restrain myself and let you all live in anticipation. So, close that out there. But yes, Yuki, beautiful artist. Just I feel like every day I get to see and interact with other amazing artists. Today, I did I did something weird, but let me see if I can pull that up real quick. So there's another artist, a little on the spicier side, uh, that goes by Laser Lizard Louis. So Lluis. Um, I actually I turned they had a posting. They had actually posted. Let me second grab this and open here. So they frequently we can put that over here. So they frequently this is Louis. They frequently post this as like a they're anything sus. They frequently post this, and I open link. I made this. I just made it a gif of their eye like looking back and forth. I wanted to keep in the original it has the signature in the one image, and I wanted to make sure it shows so it shows their art. But I sent that to them. They're like, "Oh boy, that's awesome!" And I'm like, "Yes, yes, it is. They're awesome too." They work with Melissa. I can't remember off the top of my head what Melissa's count is, but another fantastic artist. They do like I think it's like a webtoon with D&D themes. Um, they're a lizard folk, and then Melissa I think is a tiefling, and there's another woman that I think maybe she's a dragonborn. She can turn into a dragon or into a centaur. So I'm not entirely sure if she's just like a changeling or what's going on. I'd have to go back and look. I digress. Right? I love meeting super creative, talented people. It's awesome. And they're so inspiring. Like I've been thinking about animating that artwork of Lewis's for a while. It's like, man, it'd be really funny if that was a GIF. A GIF? whatever it is. And so I just did it. It's like, I hope I don't get into trouble. I probably won't. They liked it, so I'm going to say it's good. But for all intents and purposes, it's their proprietary artwork. I sent it to them to use in whatever the way they want to. And it's just practice. Practice for me to be a better artist with Clip Studio Paint. Um, I got so in the weeds. I'm going to do a shout out to Lewis too, though, actually. We'll do that while it's in my brain, because I'll forget. Because if you guys haven't checked out their work, you really should. Um, Mind you, they do a lot of not safe for work content, so slightly spicy. Do they have? I don't think. Do they stream? I know they've streamed with Melissa before. Hmm. Hmm. I do not know. Melissa. Wish there was a way to show like who I follow when they're offline, and I can't think of it off the top of my head. Tiefling Melissa, that's the one. Okay. Yeah. They mostly stream together. But I'll go ahead and put a shout out to Tiefling Melissa too, because again, super talented artist. Um the Dark Cartoon also did like a couple pinups for them. Just good stuff. Really good stuff. Maybe they'll be in this clip, it'll be both. Unexpected.
Yeah.
To an unassuming, that was fantastic. Mwah. Oh, hey Tora, how's it going? Welcome in. Um, Spacey Tora is another Tiger streamer. Amazing. I'm gonna run out of shout outs here because it's just been like a non-stop like stream of like talented people that I get to interact with. But they actually did one of my emotes. And I hope I'm gonna get back into the story here for you, so you can relax and enjoy yourself. It was a good stream earlier, by the way, Tora. I enjoyed it. Okay, close out of that. Aw, thank you. Thank you, Fallen. That was really sweet of you. Thank you for the gifted sub. Yep. Now you can use your emote. That's fantastic. Okay. Where was I? All right, so we are on to chapter 6. Marilla makes up her mind. Good. For the better, I hope. Get there they did, however, in due season. Mrs. Spencer lived in a big yellow house at White Sands Cove, and she made it to the door with surprise and welcome mingled on her benevolent face. Dear, dear, she exclaimed, you're the last folks I was looking for today, but I'm real glad to see you. You'll put your horse in. And how are you, Anne? I'm as well as can be expected, thank you, said Anne smilelessly. A blight seemed to have descended on her. I suppose we'll stay a little while stay a little while to rest the mare, said Marilla, but I promised Matthew I'd be home early. The fact is, Mrs. Spencer, there's been a queer mistake somewhere, and I've come over to see where it is. We sent word, Matthew and I, for you to bring us a boy from the asylum. We told your brother Robert to tell you we wanted a boy 10 or 11 years old. Marilla Cuthbert, you don't say so, said Mrs. Spencer in distress. Why, Robert sent the word down by his daughter Nancy, and she said you wanted a girl, didn't she, Flora Jane? Appealing to her daughter who had come out to the steps. She certainly did, Mrs. Cuthbert, corroborated Flora Jane earnestly. I'm dreadfully sorry, said Mrs. Spencer. It is too bad. But it certainly wasn't my fault, you see, Mrs. Cuthbert. I did the best I could, and I thought I was following your instructions. Nancy is a terrible flighty thing. I've often had to scold her well for her heedlessness." "It was our own fault," said Marilla resignedly. "We should have come to you ourselves and not left an important message to be passed along by word of mouth in that fashion. Anyhow, the mistake has been made, and the only thing to do now is to set it right. Can we send the child back to the asylum? I suppose they'll take her back, won't they?" "I suppose so," said Mrs. Spencer thoughtfully, "but I don't think it will be necessary to send her back. Mrs. Peter Blewett was up here yesterday, and she was saying to me how much she wished she'd sent for me for a little girl to help her. Mrs. Peter has a large family, you know, and she finds it hard to get help. Anne will be the very girl for her. I call it positively providential." Marilla did not look as if she thought Providence had much to do with the matter. Here was an unexpectedly good chance to get this unwelcome orphan off her hands, and she did not even feel grateful for it. She knew Mrs. Peter Blewett only by sight, as a small, shrewish-faced woman without an ounce of superfluous flesh on her bones, but she had heard of her, a terrible worker and driver. Mrs. Peter was said to be, and discharged servant girls told fearsome tales of her temper and stinginess and her family of pert, quarrelsome children. Marilla felt a qualm of conscience at the thought of handing Anne over to her tender mercies. "Well, I'll go in and we'll talk the matter over," she said. "And if there isn't Mrs. Peter coming up the lane this blessed minute," exclaimed Mrs. Spencer, bustling her guests through the hall into the parlor, where a deadly chill struck on them as if the air had been strained so long through dark green, closely drawn blinds that it had lost every particle of warmth it had ever possessed. "That is real lucky, for we can settle the matter right away. Take the armchair, Mrs. Cuthbert, and you sit here on the ottoman and don't wriggle. Let me take your hats. Flora Jane, go out and put the kettle on. Good afternoon, Mrs. Blewett." Blewett? I'm guessing it's Blewett. "We were just saying how fortunate it was you happened along. Let me introduce you two ladies. Mrs. Blewett, Miss Cuthbert. Please excuse me for a moment. I forgot to tell Flora Jane to take the buns out of the oven." Mrs. Spencer whisked away after pulling up the blinds. Anne, sitting mutely on the ottoman with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, stared at Mrs. Blewett as one fascinated. Was she to be given into the keeping of this sharp-faced, sharp-eyed woman? She felt a lump coming up in her throat, and her eyes smarted painfully. She was beginning to be afraid she couldn't keep the tears back when Mrs. Spencer returned, flushed and beaming, quite capable of taking any and every difficulty, physical, mental, or spiritual, into consideration and settling it out of hand. "It seems there's been a mistake about this little girl, Mrs. Blewett," she said. "I was under the impression that Mr. and Mrs. Cuthbert wanted a little girl to adopt. I was certainly told so, but it seems it was a boy they wanted. So if you're still of the same mind you were yesterday, I think she'll be just the thing for you." Mrs. Blewett darted her eyes over Anne from head to foot. "How old are you, and what's your name?" she demanded. "Anne Shirley," faltered the shrinking child, not daring to make any stipulations regarding the spelling thereof, "and I'm 11 years old." "Humph! You don't look as if there was much to you, but you're wiry. I don't know but the wiry ones are the best after all. Well, if I take you, you'll have to be a good girl, you know. Good and smart and respectful. I'll expect you to earn your keep, and no mistake about that. Yes, I suppose I might as well take her off your hands, Miss Cuthbert. The baby's awful fractious, and I'm clean worn out at attending to him. If you like, I can take her right home. Take her right home now." Marilla looked at Anne and softened at sight of the child's pale face with its look of mute misery, the misery of a helpless little creature who finds itself once more caught in the trap from which it had escaped. Marilla felt an uncomfortable conviction that if she denied the appeal of that look, It would haunt her to her dying day. Moreover, she did not fancy Mrs. Blewett. To hand a sensitive, high-strung child over to such a woman, no, she could not take the responsibility of doing that. Well, I don't know, she said slowly. I didn't say that Matthew and I had absolutely decided that we wouldn't keep her. In fact, I may say that Matthew is disposed to keep her. I just came over to find out how the mistake had occurred. I think I'd better take her home again and talk it over with Matthew. I feel that oughtn't. Ooh, I oughtn't. I don't think that's a common word anymore. I don't. I feel that I oughtn't to decide on anything without consulting him. If we make up our mind not to keep her, we'll bring or send her over to you tomorrow night. If we don't, you may know that she is going to stay with us. Will that suit you, Mrs. Blewett? I suppose it'll have to, said Mrs. Blewett ungraciously. During Marilla's speech, a sunrise had been dawning on Anne's face. First the look of despair faded out, then came a faint flush of hope. Her eyes grew deep and bright as morning stars. The child was quite transfigured. And a moment later, when Mrs. Spencer and Mrs. Blewett went out in the quest of a recipe the latter had come to borrow, she sprang up and flew across the room to Marilla. "Oh, Miss Cuthbert, did you really say that perhaps you would let me stay at Green Gables?" she said in a breathless whisper, as if speaking aloud might shatter the glorious possibility. "Did you really say it, or did I only imagine that you did?" "I think you better learn to control that imagination of yours, Anne, if you can't distinguish between what is real and what isn't," said Marilla crossly. "Yes, you did hear me say just that and no more. It isn't decided yet, and perhaps we will conclude to let Mrs. Blewett take you after all. She certainly needs you more than I do." "I'd rather go back to the asylum than go to live with her," said Anne passionately. "She looks exactly like a gimlet." Marilla smothered a smile under the conviction that Anne must be reproved for such a speech. "A little girl like you should be ashamed of talking so about a lady and a stranger," she said severely. "Go back and sit down quietly and hold your tongue and behave as a good girl should." "I'll try to do and be anything you want me if you'll only keep me," said Anne, returning meekly to her ottoman. When they arrived back at Green Gables that evening, Matthew met with them in the lane. Marilla, from afar, had noted him prowling along it and guessed his motive. She was prepared for the relief she read in his face when he saw that she had at least brought Anne back with her. But she said nothing to him relative to the affair until they were both out in the yard behind the barn milking the cows. Then she briefly told him Anne's history and the result of the interview with Mrs. Spencer. "I wouldn't give a dog I liked to that Blewett woman," said Matthew with unusual vim. Vim is a 10 out of 10 word. "I don't fancy her style myself," admitted Marilla. But it's that or keeping her ourselves, Matthew, and since you seem to want her, I suppose I'm willing, or have to be. I've been thinking over the idea until I've got kind of used to it. It seems a sort of duty. I've never brought up a child, especially a girl, and I dare say I'll make a terrible mess of it, but I'll do my best. So far as I'm concerned, Matthew, she may stay." Matthew's shy face was a glow of delight. "Well, now, I reckon you'd come to see it in that light, Marilla," he said. "She's such an interesting little thing." "It'd be more to the point if you could say she was a useful little thing," retorted Marilla. "But I'll make it my business to see she's trained to be that. And mind, Matthew, you're not to go interfering with my methods. Perhaps an old maid doesn't know much about bringing up a child, but I guess she knows more than an old bachelor. So you just leave me to manage her. When I fail, it'll be time enough to put your oar in." There, Marilla. You can have your own way," said Matthew reassuringly. "Only be a good and Only be as good and kind to her as you can be without spoiling her. I kind of think she's one of the sort you can do anything with if you only get her to love you. Marilla sniffed to express her contempt for Matthew's opinions concerning anything feminine and walked off to the dairy with the pails. I won't tell her tonight that she can stay, she reflected as she strained the milk with the creamers into the creamers. She'd be so excited that she wouldn't sleep a wink. Marilla Cuthbert, you're fairly in for it. Did you even suppose you'd see the day when you'd be adopting an orphan girl? It's surprising enough, but not so surprising as that Matthew should be at the bottom of it, him that always seemed to have such a mortal dread of little girls. Anyhow, we've decided on the experiment, and goodness only knows what will come of it. Oop. Oh my, I clickety too much clicks. Yes, so that was chapter 6. How's everybody doing? I hope you're all doing well. We are another chapter in of Green Gables, Anne of Green Gables, Anne with an E. As much as she'd like to be Cordelia, she is Anne with an E. It's so much more distinguished, you understand. I think it's pretty interesting that
Drink water.
Marilla Cuthbert took one look at Mrs. Blewett and said,
Don't forget to stretch.
Yep. Stretch. Big stretch. That's okay, Sino. I
Drink
appreciate the lurk.
water.
It's lovely knowing that you're here. I will hydrate, I will caffeinate, I will stretch, I will do all the things. Yes. Between chapters, it is always good to take care of yourselves. Very, very hydrated. I was going to say Marilla Cuthbert met Mrs. Blewett and knew immediately upon meeting her that she was not the person to take on Anne with an E. And her brother, Matthew, saying pretty much the same thing, about how he wouldn't give a dog to that woman. That's wow. She must be pretty awful. So now they're going to just send the asylum for some other poor girl. Maybe they won't have one. I don't know. We can hope that Mrs. Blewett doesn't get to have a child sent to her. Not if she's that awful. Can you imagine having such a poor reputation with the local girls that worked for her that she's just awful? I wouldn't recommend it. Okay, where were we? We are on to chapter 7. Anne says her prayers. Big stretch. One more for the road. Okay. Let me fix this real quick. That's been bothering me. I think that's a little bit better. Yeah, there we go. Now I don't have to adjust the mic height as much. Chapter 7. Anne says her prayers. When Marilla took Anne up to the bed that night, she said stiffly, "Now, Anne, I noticed last night that you threw your clothes all about the floor when you took them off. That is a very untidy habit, and I can't allow it at all. As soon as you take off any article of clothing, fold it neatly and place it on the chair. I haven't any use at all for little girls who aren't neat." "I was so harrowed up in my mind last night that I didn't think about my clothes at all," said Anne. "I'll fold them nicely tonight. They always made us do that at the asylum. Half the time, though, I'd forget. I'd be in such a hurry to get into bed nice and quiet and imagine things." "You'll have to remember a little better if you stay here," admonished Marilla. "There, that looks something like. Say your prayers now and get into bed." "I never say any prayers," announced Anne. Marilla looked horrified astonishment. Why, Anne, what do you mean? Were you never taught to say your prayers? God always wants little girls to say their prayers. Don't you know who God is, Anne? God is a spirit, infinite, eternal, and unchangeable in his being, wisdom, power, holiness, justice, goodness, and truth, responded Anne promptly and glibly. Marilla looked rather relieved. So you do know something, then. Thank goodness. You're not quite a heathen. Where did you learn that? Oh, at the asylum Sunday school. They made us learn the whole catechism. I liked it pretty well. There's something splendid about some of the words infinite, eternal, and unchangeable. Isn't that grand? It has such a roll to it, just like a big organ playing. You couldn't quite call it poetry, I suppose, but it sounds a lot like it, doesn't it? We're not talking about poetry, Anne. We are talking about saying your prayers. Don't you know it's a terrible, wicked thing not to say your prayers every night? I'm afraid you are a very bad little girl. You'd find it easier to be bad than good if you had red hair, said Anne reproachfully. People who haven't red hair don't know what trouble is. Mrs. Thomas told me that God made my hair red on purpose, and I've never cared about him since. And anyhow, I'd always be too tired at night to bother saying prayers. People who have to look after twins can't be expected to say their prayers. Now, do you honestly think they can? Marilla decided that Anne's religious training must be begun at once. Plainly, there was no time to be lost. You must say your prayers while you're under my roof, Anne. Why, of course, if you want me to, assented Anne cheerfully. I'd do anything to oblige you. But you'll have to tell me what to say for this once. After I get into bed, I'll imagine out a real nice prayer to say always. I believe that it will be quite interesting now that I come to think of it. You must kneel down, said Marilla in embarrassment. Anne knelt at Marilla's knee and looked up gravely. Why must people kneel down to pray? If I really wanted to pray, I'll tell you what I'd do. I'd get out into a great big field all alone, or into the deep, deep woods, and I'd look up into the sky. Up, up, up into that lovely blue sky that looks as if there was no end to its business. And then I'd just feel a prayer. Well, I'm ready. What am I to say? Marilla felt more embarrassment than ever. She had intended to teach Anne the childish classic, Now I lay me down to sleep. But she had, as I have told you, the glimmerings of a sense of humor, which is simply another name for a sense of the fitness of things. And it suddenly occurred to her that that simple little prayer, sacred to a white-robed childhood lisping at motherly knees, was entirely unsuited to this freckled witch of a girl who knew and cared nothing about God's love, since she had never had it translated to her through the medium of human love. You're old enough to pray for yourself, Anne, she said finally. Just thank God for your blessings and ask him humbly for the things you want. Well, I'll do my best, promised Anne, burying her face in Marilla's lap. Gracious Heavenly Father, that's the way the ministers say it in church, so I suppose it's all right in a private prayer, isn't it? She interjected, lifting her head for a moment. Gracious Heavenly Father, I thank thee for the white way of delight and the lake of shining waters, and Bonnie and the Snow Queen. I'm really extremely grateful for them, and that's all the blessings I can think of just now to thank thee for. As for the things I want, they're so numerous that it would take a great deal of time to name them all, so I will only mention the two most important. Please let me stay at Green Gables, and please let me be good looking when I grow up. And please let me be good looking when I grow up. I remain, yours respectfully, Anne Shirley. There, did I do it all right? She asked, eagerly, getting up. I could have made it much more flowery if I'd had a little more time to think it over. Poor Marilla was only preserved from complete collapse by remembering that it was not irreverence, but simply spiritual ignorance on the part of Anne that was responsible for this extraordinary petition. She tucked the child up in bed, mentally vowing that she should be taught a prayer the very next day, and as and was leaving the room with the light when Anne called her back. I've just thought of it now. I should have said Amen in place of yours respectfully, shouldn't I? The way the ministers do. I'd forgotten it. But I felt a prayer should be finished off in some way, so I put in the other. Do you suppose it will make any difference? I. I don't suppose it will, said Marilla. Go to sleep now like a good child. Good night. I can say good night tonight with a clear conscience, said Anne, cuddling luxuriously down among her pillows. Marilla retreated to the kitchen, set the candle firmly on the table, and glared at Matthew. Matthew Cuthbert. It's about time somebody adopted that child and taught her something. She's next door to a perfect heathen. Will you believe that she never said a prayer in her life till tonight? I'll send to the manse tomorrow and borrow the Peep of Day series. That's what I'll do. And she shall go to Sunday school just as soon as I can get some suitable clothes made for her. I foresee that I shall have my hands full. Well, we can't get through this world without our share of trouble. I've had a pretty easy life of it so far, but my time has come at last, and I suppose I'll just have to make the best of it. You're going to bear up under it quite well, Marilla. Good work.
I need more caffeine. My blood is not thin enough.
Yes, I shall have all of the caffeination. I am normally I drink coffee, but today I was kind of craving something a little bit sweet. So I got the winter edition of Red Bull, which is pear cinnamon. I don't normally go for these sort of things, but I was just craving one today. Yeah, something about that pear flavor is really nice. Though, to this date, my longtime favorite was the summer edition. I think it was about 8 or 9 years ago. It was a grapefruit flavor. That one was easily my favorite. Hello, Kat. How is it going? Welcome in. Oh, that's a shame, Fallen. The flavors of Red Bull are numerous. They have a June berry for their summer edition, I believe, and the winter is the pear cinnamon. They're always doing something different every season. Let's see here. We're on to chapter 8, if I recall my Roman numerals correctly. So we'll go ahead and read chapter 8, and then we might be due for another ad break, because we're right around, it'll be on the hour at that time. Chapter 8, Anne's bringing up is begun. Good work, Teeth. Thank you for the lurk, Cat. For reasons best known to herself, Marilla did not tell Anne that she was to stay at Green Gables until the next afternoon. During the forenoon, she kept the child busy with various tasks and watched over her with a keen eye while she did them. By noon, she had concluded that Anne was smart and obedient, willing to work, and quick to learn. Her most serious shortcoming seemed to be a tendency to fall into daydreams in the middle of a task and forget all about it until such time as she was sharply recalled to earth by a reprimand or a catastrophe. Catastrophe? I'm concerned. When Anne had finished washing the dinner dishes, she suddenly confronted Marilla with the air and expression of one desperately determined to learn the worst. Her thin, little body trembled from head to foot, her face flushed, and her eyes dilated until they were almost black. She clasped her hands tightly and said in an imploring voice, "Oh, please, Mrs. Cuthbert, won't you tell me if you are going to send me away or not? I've tried to be patient all the morning, but I really feel that I cannot bear not knowing any longer. It's a dreadful feeling. Please tell me. You haven't scalded the dishcloth in hot, clean water. Yeah. You haven't scalded the dishcloth in clean, hot water as I told you to do, said Marilla immovably. Just go and do it before you ask any more questions. Anne. Anne went and attended to the dishcloth. Then she returned to Marilla and fastened imploring eyes on the latter's face. Well, said Marilla, unable to find any excuse for deferring her explanation longer, I suppose I might as well tell you. Matthew and I have decided to keep you. That is, if you will try to be a good little girl and show yourself grateful. Why, child, whatever is the matter?
Drink water. Become.
You got it. I'll stay hydrated. Mm-hmm. Good one. I'm crying, said Anne in a tone of bewilderment. I can't think why. I'm glad as glad can be. Oh, glad doesn't seem the right word at all. I was glad about the white way and the cherry blossoms, but this. Oh, it's something more than glad. I'm so happy. I'll try to be so good. It will be uphill work, I expect. But for Mrs. Thomas often told me I was desperately wicked. However, I'll do my very best. But can you tell me why I'm crying? I suppose it's because you're all excited and worked up, said Marilla disapprovingly. Sit down on that chair and try to calm yourself. I'm afraid you both cry and laugh far too easily. I'm afraid you both cry and laugh far too easily. Yes, you can stay here and we will try to do right by you. You must go to school. But it's only a fortnight till vacation, so it isn't worthwhile for you to start before it opens again in September. What am I to call you? Asked Anne. Shall I always say Miss Cuthbert? Can I call you Aunt Marilla? No, you'll call me just plain Marilla. I'm not used to being called Miss Cuthbert, and it would make me nervous. It sounds awfully disrespectful to say just Marilla, protested Anne. I guess there'll be nothing disrespectful in it if you're careful to speak respectfully. Everybody young and old in Avonlea, in Avonlea calls me Marilla except the minister. He says Miss Cuthbert when he thinks of it. I'd love to call you Aunt Marilla, said Anne wistfully. I never had an aunt or any relation at all, not even a grandmother. It would make me feel as if I really belonged to you. Can't I call you Aunt Marilla? No, I'm not your aunt, and I don't believe in calling people names that don't belong to them. But we could imagine you were my aunt. I couldn't, said Marilla grimly. Do you never imagine things different from what they really are? Asked Anne wide-eyed. No. Oh! Anne drew a long breath. Oh, Miss Marilla, how much you miss. I don't believe in imagining things different from what they really are, retorted Marilla. This is the most neurodivergent with neurotypical conversation, and this is over 100 years old. It's just this incredibly all over the place ADHD child with this very stoic, staid, hardworking, long-lived woman. It's funny. I don't believe in imagining things different from what they really are, retorted Marilla. When the Lord puts us in certain circumstances, he doesn't mean for us to imagine them away. And that reminds me, go into the sitting room, Anne. Be sure your feet are clean and don't let any flies in. And bring me out the illustrated card that's on the mantelpiece. The Lord's Prayer is on it. and you'll devote your spare time this afternoon to learning it off by heart. There's to be no more of such praying as I heard last night." "I suppose I was very awkward," said Anne apologetically, "but then, you see, I've never had any practice." Spot on. Spot on, Moo, absolutely. It's funny when you can look back and be like, "Oh, we know what that thing is called now," but at the time no one had any idea. Yeah, I don't think, I feel like the diagnosis and discovery of ADHD or ADD at the time was probably in the 80s. Don't quote me on that. I'd have to look um, at some scientific journals to find the answer to that. But Moo, you're right. They didn't have a term for this. She was just a precocious child or a excitable child, daydreamer. 1902. Oh, 1902. Okay. I didn't realize it had been around that long, because I remember it was like a very common practice. Um, I think by junior high or high school that a lot of kids were being diagnosed with ADD and then later ADHD and given, I think they were given Ritalin. Um, ADHD was first identified in 1902 by British pediatrician Sir George Still. He described the condition as an abnormal defect of moral control in children. Actually, I would say that neurodivergent people have a greater sense of justice and morality, but that's interesting. He found that some affected children could not control their behavior in the same way a typical child would. It's just, yeah, okay. Doctor, would it be still, if he's a pediatrician, he would still be doctor, but he's sir. I don't know, technicalities. Well, you heard it here, folks. Yeah, the black and white thinking is a hallmark of autism. You're right. I'm glad that in more recent years they've been able to. It's possible. I don't think anybody can just be a sir. I'm pretty sure they have to be knighted or like given some sort of authority by the crown. I would have to speak to someone, maybe Fallen Teeth, maybe would know specifically. Um, yeah, that's interesting. So 1902, you learned it here first. "I suppose I was very awkward," said Anne apologetically, "but then, you see, I've never had any practice. You couldn't really expect a person to pray very well the first time she tried, could you? I thought out a splendid prayer after I went to bed, just as I promised you I would. It was nearly as long as a minister's and so poetical. But would you believe it? I couldn't remember one word when I woke up this morning, and I'm afraid I'll never be able to think out another one as good. Somehow, things never are so good when they are thought out a second time. Have you ever noticed that?" I I think I misspoke, Teeth. My apologies. It wasn't added to the DSM until 1952. So discussed 1902, wasn't added to the medical documentation until 1952. Now that's a long time to dicker over whether something is or isn't real. Interesting. Here is something for you to notice, Anne. When I tell you to do a thing, I want you to obey me at once, and not stand stock still and discourse about it. Just you go and do as I bid. Anne promptly departed for the sitting room across the hall. She failed to return after waiting 10 minutes. Marilla laid down her knitting and marched after her with a grim expression. She found Anne standing motionless before a picture hanging on the wall between the two windows, with her hands clasped behind her. Oh, it's a sneeze. Pardon. With her hands clasped behind her, her face uplifted, and her eyes a star with dreams, the white and green light strained through apple trees and clustering vines outside fell over the rapt little figure with a half unearthly radiance. Thank you. Anne, whatever are you thinking of? Demanded Marilla sharply. Anne came back to earth with a start. That, she said, pointing to the picture, a rather vivid chromo entitled Christ Blessing Little Children. And I was just imagining I was one of them, that I was the little girl in the blue dress, standing off by herself in the corner as if she didn't belong to anybody, like me. She looks lonely and sad, don't you think? I guess she hadn't any father or mother of her own. But she wanted to be blessed, too, so she crept shyly up on the outside of the crowd, hoping nobody would notice her except him. I'm sure I know just how she felt. Her heart must have beat and her hands must have got cold like mine did when I asked you if I could stay. She was afraid he mightn't notice her. But it's likely he did, don't you think? I've been trying to imagine it all out, her edging a little nearer all the time until she was quite close to him, and then he would look at her and put his hand on her hair, and oh, such a thrill of joy as would run over her, but I wish the artist hadn't painted him so sorrowful looking. All his pictures are like that, if you've noticed. But I don't believe he could really have looked so sad, or the children would have been afraid of him. Anne, said Marilla, wondering why she had broken into the speech long before, you shouldn't talk that way. It's irreverent, positively irreverent. Anne's eyes marveled. Why, I felt just as reverent as could be. I'm sure I didn't mean to be irreverent. Well, I don't suppose you did. But it doesn't sound right to talk so familiarly about such things. And another thing, Anne, when I send you after something, you are to bring it at once and not fall into mooning and imagining before pictures. Remember that. Take the card and come right to the kitchen. Now, sit down in the corner and learn that prayer off by heart. Anne set the card up against the jugful of apple blossoms she had brought in to decorate the dinner table. Marilla had eyed that decoration askance, but had said nothing, propped her chin on her hands, and fell to studying it intently for several silent minutes. I like this, she announced at length. It's beautiful. I've heard it before. I heard the superintendent of the asylum Sunday school say it over once. But I didn't like it then. He had such a cracked voice and he prayed it so mournfully. I really felt sure he thought praying was a disagreeable duty. This isn't poetry, but it makes me feel just the same way poetry does. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. That is just like a line of music. Oh, I'm so glad you thought of making me learn this, Miss Marilla. Miss Marilla. Well, learn it and hold your tongue, said Marilla shortly. Anne tipped the vase of apple blossoms near enough to bestow a soft kiss on a pink-cupped bud, and then studied diligently for some moments longer. Marilla, she demanded presently, do you think that I shall ever have a bosom friend in Avonlea? A what kind of friend? A bosom friend, an intimate friend, you know, a really kindred spirit to whom I can confide my inmost soul. I've dreamed of meeting her all my life. I never really supposed I would, but so many of my loveliest dreams have come true all at once that perhaps this one will too. Do you think it's possible? Diana Barry lives over at Orchard Slope, and she's about your age. She's a very nice little girl, and perhaps she will be a playmate for you when she comes home. She's visiting her aunt over at Carmody just now. You'll have to be careful how you behave yourself, though. Mrs. Barry is a very particular woman. She won't let Diana play with any little girl who isn't nice and good. Anne looked at Marilla through the apple blossoms, her eyes aglow with interest. What is Diana like? Her hair isn't red, is it? Oh, I hope not. It's bad enough to have red hair myself, but I positively couldn't endure it in a bosom friend. What? What? Diana is a very pretty little girl. She has black eyes and hair and rosy cheeks. And she is good and smart, which is better than being pretty. Marilla was as fond of morals as the Duchess in Wonderland, and was firmly convinced that one should be tacked on to every remark made to a child who was being brought up. But Anne waved the moral inconsequently aside, and seized only on the delightful possibility before it. Oh, I'm so glad she's pretty. Next to being beautiful oneself, and that's impossible in my case. It would be best to have a beautiful bosom friend. When I lived with Mrs. Thomas, she had a bookcase in her sitting room with glass doors. There weren't any books in it. Mrs. Thomas kept her best china and her preserves there, when she had any preserves to keep. One of the doors was broken. Mr. Thomas smashed it one night when he was slightly intoxicated, but the other was whole, and I used to pretend that my reflection in it was another little girl who lived in it. I called her Katie Maurice, and we were very intimate. I used to talk to her by the hour, especially on Sunday, and tell her everything. Katie was the comfort and consolation of my life. We used to pretend that the bookcase was enchanted, and if I only knew the spell, I could open the door and step right into the room where Katie Maurice lived, instead of into Mrs. Thomas's shelves of preserves and china. And then Katie Maurice would have taken me by the hand and led me out into a wonderful place, all flowers and sunshine and fairies, and we would have lived there happy forever after. When I went to live with Mrs. Hammond, it just broke my heart to leave Katie Maurice. She felt it dreadfully, too. I know she did, for she was crying when she kissed me good-bye through the bookcase door. There was no bookcase at Mrs. Hammond's, but just up the river a little way from the house there was a long, green little valley, and the loveliest echo lived there. It echoed back every word you said, even if you didn't talk a bit loud. So I imagined that it was a little girl called Violetta, and we were great friends, and I loved her almost as well as I loved Katie Maurice. Not quite, but almost, you know. The night before I went to the asylum, I said goodbye to Violetta, and oh, her goodbye came back to me in such sad, sad tones. I had become so attached to her that I hadn't the heart to imagine a bosom friend at the asylum, even if there had been any scope for imagination there. I think it's just as well there wasn't, said Marilla dryly. I don't approve of such goings on. You seem to half believe your own imaginations. It will be well for you to have a real live friend to put such nonsense out of your head. But don't let Mrs. Barry hear you talking about your Katie Maurices and your Violettas, or she'll think you tell stories. Oh, I won't. Sus. I couldn't talk of them to everybody. Their memories are too sacred for that. But I thought I'd like to have you know about them. Oh, look, here's a big bee just tumbled out of an apple blossom. Just think what a lovely place to live, in an apple blossom. Fancy going to sleep in it when the wind was rocking it. If I wasn't a human girl, I think I'd like to be a bee and live among the flowers. Yesterday you wanted to be a seagull, sniffed Marilla. I think you are very fickle-minded. I told you to learn that prayer and not talk, but it seems impossible for you to stop talking if you've got anybody that will listen to you. So go up to your room and learn it. Oh, I know it pretty nearly all now. All but just the last line. Well, never mind. Do as I tell you. Go to your room and finish learning it well, and stay there until I call you down to help me get tea. Can I take the apple blossoms with me for company? Pleaded Anne. No. You don't want your room cluttered up with flowers. You should have left them on the tree in the first place. I did feel a little that way, too, said Anne. I kind of felt I shouldn't shorten their lovely lives by picking them. I wouldn't want to be picked if I were an apple blossom. But the temptation was irresistible. What do you think? What do you do when you meet with an irresistible temptation? Anne, did you hear me tell you to go to your room? Anne sighed, retreated to the east gable, and sat down in a chair by the window. There. I know this prayer. I learned that last sentence coming upstairs. Now I'm going to imagine things into this room so that they'll always stay imagined. The floor is covered with white velvet carpet, with pink roses all over it, and there are pink silk curtains at the windows. The walls are hung with gold and silver brocade tapestry. The furniture is mahogany. I never saw any mahogany, but it does sound so luxurious. This is a couch all heaped with gorgeous silken cushions, pink and blue and crimson and gold, and I am reclining gracefully on it. I can see my reflection in that splendid big mirror hanging on the wall. I am tall and regal, clad in a gown of trailing white lace, with a pearl cross at my breast and pearls in my hair. My hair is of midnight darkness, and my skin is a clear ivory pallor. My name is the Lady Cordelia Fitzgerald. No, it isn't. I can't make that seem real. She danced up to the little looking-glass and peered into it. Her pointed, freckled face and solemn gray eyes peered back at her. "You're only Anne of Green Gables," she said earnestly, "and I see you just as you are looking now. Whenever I try to imagine I'm the Lady Cordelia, but it's a million times nicer to be Anne of Green Gables than Anne of Nowhere in particular, isn't it?" She bent forward, kissed her reflection affectionately, and betook herself to the open window. "Dear Snow Queen, good afternoon. And good afternoon, dear birches down in the hollow, and good afternoon, dear gray house up on the hill. I wonder if Diana is to be my bosom friend. I hope she will, and I shall love her very much. But I must never quite forget Katie Maurice and Violetta. They would feel so hurt if I did, and I'd hate to hurt anybody's feelings, even a little bookcase girl's or a little echo girl's. I must be careful to remember them and send them a kiss every day." Anne blew a couple of airy kisses from her fingertips past the cherry blossoms, and then, with her chin in her hands, drifted luxuriously out on a sea of daydreams. Aw, that's so pretty. Okay. Yes. There was a sniz. I snizzed. We are 7 minutes past the hour, and I am due for an ad break. I think I will read until the next hour, and then we'll find someone. That puts us at about 3 hours. Let's see. And then at that time we'll find someone we can go visit. So, as a friendly reminder, be sure to hydrate, caffeinate, stretch, do whatever it is you need to be comfortable and enjoy the story. So if you need to wrap up in a blanket, put me on your phone and fall asleep to the story. That's fine too. I guess in my Anne of Green Gables imaginings, that's what I imagine happens. People lurk and listen and then fall asleep, and then without any interaction with their phones or their computers, the technology goes to sleep as they fall asleep. And I think that's lovely. Okay, let's go ahead and do that ad real quick, and then we won't have to deal with any more ads for the rest of the hour, and we should be able to read at least 2, maybe 3 more chapters. We'll see how it goes. One moment. Be right back. Vexing smushed. All right then. Okay. Let's see here. That and that. Okay. We are going to read chapter 9, and I think we'll get through chapter 10. We'll just see how things go in the next 30 minutes or so, depending on how verbose Lucy decided to be. All right, everybody strapped in. Let's go ahead and read another chapter. Mrs. Rachel, Chapter 9. Mrs. Rachel Lynde is properly horrified. Ominous. Anne had been a fortnight at Green Gables before Mrs. Lynde arrived to inspect her. Mrs. Rachel, to do her justice, was not to blame for this. A severe and unseasonable attack of gripe, I think. Unseasonable attack of gripe had confined that good lady to her house ever since the occasion of her last visit to Green Gables. Mrs. Rachel was not often sick, and had a well-defined contempt for people who were. But gripe, she asserted, was like no other illness on earth, and could only be interpreted as one of the special visitations of Providence. As soon as her doctor allowed her to put her foot out of doors, she hurried up to Green Gables, bursting with curiosity to see Matthew's and Marilla's orphan, concerning whom all sorts of stories and suppositions had gone abroad in Avonlea. Anne had made good use of every Avonlea. I don't know why I'm struggling with that. Anne had made good use of every waking moment of that fortnight. Already she was acquainted with every tree and shrub about the place. She had discovered that a lane opened out below the apple orchard and ran through a belt of woodland. And she had explored it to its furthest end in all its delicious vagaries of brook and bridge, fir coppice and wild cherry arch, corners thick with fern, and branching byways of maple and mountain ash. She had made friends with the spring down in the hollow, that wonderful, deep, clear, icy cold spring. It was set about that with smooth red sandstones and rimmed in by great palm-like clumps of water fern. And beyond it was a log bridge over the brook. That bridge led Anne's dancing feet up over a wooded hill beyond, where perpetual twilight reigned under the straight, thick-growing firs and spruces. The only flowers there were myriads of delicate June bells, those shyest and sweetest of woodland blossoms, and a few pale, aerial star flowers, like the spirits of last year's blossoms. Gossamers glimmered like threads of silver among the trees, and the fir boughs and tassels seemed to utter friendly speech. Do you see what I mean, though? Like, Lucy writes in such a delightfully delicious way. It's just, mwah, super good. This reminds me. Okay. Da 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 da. There we go. A bridge over the brook. Yep. All these raptured voyages of exploration were made in the odd half hours which she was allowed for play, and Anne talked to Matthew and Marilla half deaf over her discoveries. Not that Matthew complained. To be sure, he listened to it all with a wordless smile of enjoyment on his face. Marilla permitted the chatter until she found herself becoming too interested in it, whereupon she always promptly quenched Anne by a curt command to hold her tongue. Anne was out in the orchard when Mrs. Rachel came, wandering at her own sweet will. through the lush, tremulous grasses splashed with ruddy evening sunshine, so that good lady had an excellent chance to talk her illness fully over, describing every ache and pulse beat with such evident enjoyment that Marilla thought even gripe must bring its compensations. When details were exhausted, Mrs. Rachel introduced the real reason of her call. I've been hearing some surprising things about you and Matthew. I don't suppose you are any more surprised than I am myself, said Marilla. I'm getting over my surprise now. It was too bad there was such a mistake, said Mrs. Rachel sympathetically. Couldn't you have sent her back? I suppose we could, but we decided not to. Matthew took a fancy to her, and I must say, I like her myself. Although I admit she has her faults. The house seems a different place already. She's a real bright little thing. Marilla said more than she had intended to say when she began, for she read disapproval in Mrs. Rachel's expression. It's a great responsibility you've taken on yourself, said the lady gloomily, especially when you have never had any experience with children. You don't know much about her or her real disposition, I suppose, and there's no guessing how a child like that will turn out. But I don't want to discourage you, I'm sure, Marilla. I'm not feeling discouraged, was Marilla's dry response. When I make up my mind to do a thing, it stays made up, just like her brother. I suppose you'd like to see Anne. I'll call her in. Anne came running in presently, her face sparkling with the delight of her orchard rovings, but abashed at finding herself in the unexpected presence of a stranger. She halted confusingly inside the door. She certainly was an odd-looking little creature in the short, tight wincey dress she had worn from the asylum, below which her thin legs seemed ungracefully long. Her freckles were more numerous and obtrusive than ever. That's what happens when we hang out in the sun. The wind had ruffled her hatless hair into over-brilliant disorder. It had never looked redder than at that moment. Well, they didn't pick you for your looks, that's sure and certain, was Mrs. Rachel Lynde's empathetic comment. Mrs. Rachel was one of those delightful and popular people who pride themselves on speaking their mind without fear or favor. An asshole. She's terribly skinny and homely, Marilla. Come here, child, and let me have a look at you. Lawful heart, did anyone ever see such freckles and hair as red as carrots? Come here, child, I say. Anne came there, but not exactly as Mrs. Rachel expected. With one bound, she crossed the kitchen floor and stood before Mrs. Rachel. Her face scarlet with anger, her lips quivering, and her whole slender form trembling from head to foot. I hate you, she cried in a choked voice, stamping her foot on the floor. I hate you, I hate you, I hate you. A louder stamp with each assertion of hatred. How dare you call me skinny and ugly? How dare you say I'm freckled and red-headed? You are rude, impolite, You are a rude, impolite, and unfeeling woman. Anne! Exclaimed Marilla in consternation. But Anne continued to face Mrs. Rachel undauntedly. Head up, eyes blazing, hands clenched. Passionate indignation exhaling from her like an atmosphere. How dare you say such things about me, she repeated vehemently. How would you like to have such things said about yourself? How would you like to be told that you are fat and clumsy and probably hadn't a spark of imagination in you? I don't care if I do hurt your feelings by saying so. I hope I hurt them. You have hurt mine worse than they were ever hurt before, even by Mrs. Thomas' intoxicated husband, and I'll never forgive you for it. Never, never. Stamp, stamp. Did anybody ever see such a temper? Exclaimed the horrified Mrs. Rachel. Anne, go to your room and stay there until I come up. said Marilla, recovering her powers of speech with difficulty. Anne, bursting into tears, rushed to the hall door, slammed it until the tins on the porch wall outside rattled in sympathy, and fled through the hall and up the stairs like a whirlwind. A subdued slam above told that the door of the east gable had been shut with equal vehemence. "Well, I don't envy you your job bringing that up, Marilla," said Mrs. Rachel with unspeakable solemnity. With unspeakable solemnity. Marilla opened her lips to say she knew not what of apology or depreciation. What did she say was a surprise to herself then and ever afterwards. "You shouldn't have twitted about her looks, Rachel." "Marilla Cuthbert, you don't mean to say that you are upholding her in such a terrible display of temper as we've just seen?" demanded Mrs. Rachel indignantly. "No," said Marilla slowly. "I'm not trying to excuse her. She's been very naughty and I'll have to give her a talking to about it. But we must make allowances for her. She's never been taught what is right, and you were too hard on her, Rachel." Marilla could not help tacking on that last sentence, although she was again surprised at herself for doing it. Mrs. Rachel got up with an air of offended dignity. "Well, I see that I'll have to be very careful what I say after this, Marilla, since the fine feelings of orphans, brought from goodness knows where, have to be considered before anything else. Oh no, I'm not vexed. Don't worry yourself. I'm too sorry for you to leave any room for anger in my mind. You'll have your own troubles with that child, but if you'll take my advice, which I suppose you won't do, although I've brought up 10 children and buried 2, you'll do that talking to you mentioned with a fair-sized birch switch. I should think that would be the most effective language for that kind of child. Her temper matches her hair, I guess. Well, good evening, Marilla. I hope you'll come down to see me often as usual, but you can't expect me to visit here again in a hurry. If I'm liable to be flown at and insulted in such a fashion, it's something new in my experience." "Bitch! Get out my house!" Whereat Mrs. Rachel swept out and away, if a fat woman who always waddled could, it be said to sweep away, and Marilla, with a very solemn face, betook herself to the east gable. On the way upstairs, she pondered uneasily as to what she ought to do. She felt no little dismay over the scene that had just been enacted. How unfortunate that Anne should have displayed such temper before Mrs. Rachel Lynde, of all people. Then Marilla suddenly became aware of an uncomfortable and rebuking consciousness that she felt more humiliation over this than sorrow over the discovery of such a serious defect in Anne's disposition. And how was she to punish her? The amiable suggestion of the birch switch, to the efficiency of which all of Mrs. Rachel's own children could have borne smarting testimony, did not appeal to Marilla. She did not believe she could whip a child. No, some other method of punishment must be found to bring Anne to a proper realization of the enormity of her offense. Marilla found Anne facing downward on her bed, crying bitterly, quite oblivious of muddy boots on a clean counterpane. "Anne," she said, not ungently. No answer. "Anne," with greater severity, "get off that bed this minute and listen to what I have to say to you." Anne squirmed off the bed and sat rigidly on a chair beside it, her face swollen and tear-stained and her eyes fixed stubbornly on the floor. "This is a nice way for you to behave, Anne. Aren't you ashamed of yourself?" "She hadn't any right to call me ugly and red-headed," retorted Anne, evasive and defiant. "You hadn't any right to fly into such a fury and talk the way you did to her, Anne. I was ashamed of you, thoroughly ashamed of you. I wanted you to behave nicely to Mrs. Lynde, and instead of that you have disgraced me." I'm sure I don't know why you should lose your temper like that just because Mrs. Lynde said you were red-haired and homely. You said it yourself often enough. Oh, but there's such a difference between saying a thing yourself and hearing other people say it. Self-depreciating versus, outward name-calling. I get it. Oh, but there's such a difference between saying a thing yourself and hearing other people say it, wailed Anne. You may know a thing is so, but you can't help hoping other people don't quite think it is. I suppose you think I have an awful temper, but I couldn't help it. When she said those things, something just rose right up in me and choked me. I had to fly out at her. Well, you made a fine exhibition of yourself, I must say. Mrs. Lynde will have a nice story to tell about you everywhere, and she'll tell it, too. It was a dreadful thing for you to lose your temper like that, Anne. Just imagine how you would feel if somebody told you to your face that you were skinny and ugly, pleaded Anne tearfully. An old remembrance suddenly rose up before Marilla. She had been a very small child when she had heard one aunt say of her to another, "What a pity she is such a dark, homely little thing." Marilla was every day of 50 before the sting had gone out of that memory. I don't say that I think Mrs. Lynde was exactly right in saying what she did to you, Anne, she admitted in a softer tone. Rachel is too outspoken, but that is no excuse for such behavior on your part. She was a stranger, and an elderly person, and my visitor. All three very good reasons why you should have been respectful to her. You were rude and saucy, and Marilla had a saving inspiration of punishment, and you must go to her and tell her you are very sorry for your bad temper and ask her to forgive you. I can never do that, said Anne determinedly and darkly. You can punish me in any way you like, Marilla. You can shut me up in a dark, damp dungeon inhabited by snakes and toads and feed me only on bread and water, and I shall not complain. But I cannot ask Mrs. Lynde to forgive me. We're not in the habit of shutting people up in dark, damp dungeons, said Marilla dryly, especially as they're rather scarce in Avonlea. But apologize to Mrs. Lynde you must and shall, and you'll stay here in your room until you can tell me you're willing to do it. I shall have to stay here forever then, said Anne mournfully, because I can't tell Mrs. Lynde I'm sorry I said those things to her. How can I? I'm not sorry. I'm sorry I've vexed you, but I'm glad I told her just what I did. It was a great satisfaction. I can't say I'm sorry when I'm not, can I? I can't even imagine I'm sorry. Perhaps your imagination will be in better working order by the morning, said Marilla, rising to depart. You'll have the night to think over your conduct and you'll have the night to think over your conduct in and come to a better frame of mind. You said you would try to be a very good girl if we kept you at Green Gables, but I must say it hasn't seemed very much like it this evening. Leaving this Parthian shaft to rankle in Anne's stormy bosom, Marilla descended to the kitchen, grievously troubled in mind and vexed in soul. She was as angry with herself as with Anne, because whenever she recalled Mrs. Rachel's dumbfounded countenance, her lips twitched with amusement, and she felt a most reprehensible desire to laugh. This is one of those situations where your child has done something that they're not supposed to do, but it was so funny, and you have to discipline them. You don't do the thing, and then behind closed doors you have to laugh and smile. No, we do not scream profanities in public. Was it funny seeing the shocked looks on people's faces? Yes. Were you supposed to do it? No. I digress. We are almost 40 minutes past the hour. I think we can finish chapter 10 today, and then we'll find somebody lovely that we can go dive into. Perhaps Neff or Tiger Faye if they're streaming. Um, we'll just have to take a look and see who's about. I think my friend, the Curious One, is doing a stream. Um, I believe it was their birthday, or is their birthday? Recently of their birthday. Speaking of birthdays, happy birthday, Fallen. Again, I think your birthday was over the weekend, but regardless, happy birthday, my friend. We are on chapter 10, Anne's apology. Oof. Rough. Marilla said nothing to Matthew about the affair that evening, but when Anne proved still refractory, the next morning an explanation had to be made to account for her absence from the breakfast table. Marilla told Matthew the whole story, taking pains to impress him with a due sense of the enormity of Anne's behavior. I bet he would have thought it was funny, too. It's a good thing Rachel Lynde got a callin' down. She's a meddlesome old gossip, was Matthew's consolatory rejoinder. There was a texture to that whole paragraph that I can't even begin to describe. Like a mouthfeel. It just had this flavor to it. It's a good thing Rachel Lynde got a calling down. She's a meddlesome old gossip, was Matthew's consolatory rejoinder. Nobody writes like that. That is delicious. In fact, I liked it so much, I'm gonna have to do that later. I don't know. I'll just put a little button in. We'll just put rejoinder. There we go. Thereabouts. Hooray! Okay. Matthew Cuthbert, I'm astonished at you. You know that Anne's behavior was dreadful, and yet you take her part. I suppose you'll be saying next thing that she oughtn't. Oh, that's such a weird word. That she oughtn't to be punished at all. Well, now, no, not exactly, said Matthew uneasily. I reckon she ought to be punished a little, but don't be too hard on her, Marilla. Recollect she hasn't ever had anyone to teach her right. You're going to give her something to eat, aren't you? When did you ever hear of me starving people into good behavior? Demanded Marilla indignantly. She'll have her meals regular, and I'll carry them up to her myself. But she'll stay up there until she's willing to apologize to Mrs. Lynde, and that's final, Matthew. Breakfast, dinner, and supper were very silent meals, for Anne still remained obdurate. After each meal, Marilla carried a well-filled tray to the east gable and brought it down later on, not noticeably depleted. Matthew eyed its last descent with a troubled eye. Had Anne eaten anything at all? When Marilla went out that evening to bring the cows from the back pasture, Matthew, who had been hanging about the barns and watching, slipped into the house with the air of a burglar and crept upstairs. As a general thing, Matthew gravitated between the kitchen and the little bedroom off the hall where he slept. Once in a while he ventured uncomfortably into the parlor or sitting room when the minister came to tea. But he had never been upstairs in his own house since the spring he helped Marilla paper the spare bedroom, and that was 4 years ago. 4 years! He hasn't been upstairs in his own house in 4 years. That's wild. Absolutely wild. He tiptoed along the hall and stood for several minutes outside the door of the east gable before he summoned courage to tap on it with his fingers and then open the door to peep in. I suppose a bit of an effort, but still, it's your own house. Anne was sitting on the yellow chair by the window, gazing mournfully out into the garden. Very small and unhappy she looked, and Matthew's heart smote him. He softly closed the door and tiptoed over to her. Anne, he whispered, as if afraid of being overheard. How are you making it, Anne? Anne smiled, wanly. Wanly? Wanly. I think it's Wanley. Wanley? It's one of those words I've always read. I knew what it meant, but pronunciation, I don't know. Do not know. Wanky? Oh no. Um in a weak or pale way, so yes. Sad, weak, pale, but pronouncedly. Hmm. Wanley. Ah, Wanley. Well, there you go. Wanley. The more you know. Anne smiled wanly. Pretty well. I imagine a good deal, and that helps to pass the time. Of course, it's rather lonesome, but then I may as well get used to that. Stubborn child. Anne smiled again, bravely facing the long years of solitary imprisonment before her. Years? Brave years. She is so stubborn that she is absolutely not going to apologize to Mrs. Lind. That is amazing. It does sound like something I would have done though. Oh well. Matthew recollected that he must say what he had come to say without loss of time, lest Marilla return prematurely. Well now, Anne, don't you think you'd better do it and have it over with? He whispered. It'll have to be done sooner or later, you know, for Marilla's a dreadful determined woman. Dreadful determined, Anne. Do it right off, I say, and have it over. Do you mean apologize to Mrs. Lynde? Yes, apologize. That's the very word, said Matthew eagerly. Just smooth it over, so to speak. That's what I was trying to get at. I suppose I could do it to oblige you, said Anne thoughtfully. It would be true enough to say I am sorry, because I am sorry now. I wasn't a bit sorry last night. I was mad clear through, and I stayed mad all night. And I know I did, because I woke up 3 times and I was just furious. Every time. But this morning it was all over. I wasn't in a temper any more, and it left a dreadful sort of goneness, too. I felt so ashamed of myself, but I just couldn't think of going and telling Mrs. Lynde so. It would be so humiliating. Hence, good punishment. I made up my mind I'd stay shut up here forever rather than do that. But still, I'd do anything for you if you really want me to. Well, now, of course I do. It's terrible lonesome downstairs without you. Just go and smooth it over. That's a good girl. Very well, said Anne resignedly. I'll tell Marilla as soon as she comes in that I've repented. That's right, Anne, but don't tell Marilla I said anything about it. She might think I was putting my oar in and I promise not to do that. Wild horses won't drag the secret from me, promised Anne solemnly. How would wild horses drag a secret from a person anyhow? But Matthew was gone. Scared at his own success, he fled hastily to the remotest corner of the horse pasture, lest Marilla should suspect what he had been up to. Marilla herself, upon her return to the house, was agreeably surprised to hear a plaintive voice calling Marilla over the banisters. Well, she said, going into the hall, I'm sorry I lost my temper and said rude things, and I'm willing to go and tell Mrs. Lynde so. Very well. Marilla's crispness gave no sign of her relief. She had been wondering what under the canopy she should do if Anne did not give in. I'll take you down after milking. Accordingly, after milking, behold Marilla and Anne walking down the lane, the former erect and triumphant, the latter drooping and dejected. But halfway down, Anne's dejection vanished as if by enchantment. She lifted her head and stepped lightly along, her eyes fixed on the sunset sky and an air of subdued exhilaration about her. Marilla beheld the change disapprovingly. This was no meek, penitent such as it behooved her to take into the presence of the offended Mrs. Lynde. "What are you thinking of, Anne?" she asked sharply. "I'm imagining out what I must say to Mrs. Lynde," answered Anne dreamily. This was satisfactory, or should have been so, but Marilla could not rid herself of the notion that something in her scheme of punishment was going askew. Anne had no business to look so rapt and radiant. Rapt and radiant Anne continued until they were in the very presence of Mrs. Lynde, who was sitting knitting by her kitchen window. Then the radiance vanished. Mournful penitence appeared on every feature. Before a word was spoken, Anne suddenly went down on her knees before the astonished Mrs. Rachel and held out her hands beseechingly. "Oh, Mrs. Lynde, I am so extremely sorry," she said with a quiver in her voice. "I could never express all my sorrow, no, not if I used up a whole dictionary. You must just imagine it. I behaved terribly to you, and I've disgraced the dear friends Matthew and Marilla who have let me stay at Green Gables, although I'm not a boy. I'm a dreadfully wicked and ungrateful girl, and I deserve to be punished and cast out by respectable people forever. It was very wicked of me to fly into a temper because you told me the truth. It was the truth. Every word you said was true. My hair is red, and I'm freckled and skinny and ugly. What I said to you was true too, but I shouldn't have said it. Oh, Mrs. Lynde." The cheek! "Oh, Mrs. Lynde, please, please forgive me. If you refuse, it will be a lifelong sorrow to me. You wouldn't like to inflict a lifelong sorrow on a poor little orphan girl, would you, even if she had a dreadful temper? Oh, I'm sure you wouldn't. Please say you forgive me, Mrs. Lynde." Anne clasped her hands together, bowed her head, and waited for the word of judgment. "Old fat witch. Yes, it's true, but sorry you had to hear it from me. Accurate." There was no mistaking her sincerity. It breathed in every tone of her voice. Both Marilla and Mrs. Lynde recognized its unmistakable ring, but the former understood in dismay that Anne was actually enjoying her valley of humiliation, was reveling in the thoroughness of her abasement. Where was the wholesome punishment upon which she, Marilla, had plumed herself? Anne had turned it into a species of positive pleasure. Good Mrs. Lynde, not being overburdened with perception, did not see this. She only perceived that Anne had made a very thorough apology, and all resentment vanished from her kindly, if somewhat officious, heart. "There, there, get up, child," she said heartily. "Of course I forgive you." Apparently she's as dumb as a rock. "I guess I was a little too hard on you anyway, but I'm such an outspoken person you mustn't mind me. That's what. It can't be denied your hair is terrible red, but I knew a girl once, went to school with her in fact, whose hair was every mite as red as yours when she was young, but when she grew up it darkened to a real handsome auburn. I wouldn't be a mite surprised if yours did too, not a mite." "Oh, Mrs. Lynde," Anne drew a long breath as she rose to her feet. "You have given me hope, given me a hope. I shall always feel that you are a benefactor. Oh, I could endure anything if I only thought my hair would be a handsome auburn when I grew up. It would be so much easier to be good if one's hair was a handsome auburn, don't you think? And now may I go out into your garden and sit on the bench under the apple trees while you and Marilla are talking? There is so much more scope for imagination out there." "Laws, yes, run along, child, and you can pick a bouquet of them white June lilies over in the corner if you like." As the door closed behind Anne, Mrs. Lynde got briskly up to light a lamp. She's a real odd little thing. Take this chair, Marilla. It's easier than the one you've got. I just keep that for the hired boy to sit on. Yes, she certainly is an odd child, but there is something kind of taking about her after all. I don't feel so surprised at you and Matthew keeping her as I did, nor so sorry for you either. She may turn out all right. Of course, she has a queer way of expressing herself. A little too, well, too kind of forcible, you know. But she'll likely get over that now that she's come to live among civilized folks. Rude? Everything that comes out of this woman's mouth is just so terrible. Mm. She's well written. She's awful, but she's well written. And then her temper's pretty quick, I guess. But there's one comfort. A child that has a quick temper just blaze up and cool down. Ain't never likely to be sly or deceitful. Preserve me from a sly child, that's what. On the whole, Marilla, I kind of like her. When Marilla went home, Anne came out of the fragrant twilight of the orchard with a sheaf of white narcissi in her hands. I apologized pretty well, didn't I? She said proudly as they went down the lane. I thought since I had to do it, I might as well do it thoroughly. You did it thoroughly, all right. All right enough, was Marilla's comment. Marilla was dismayed at finding herself inclined to laugh over the recollection. She had also an uneasy feeling that she ought to scold Anne for apologizing so well, but then that was ridiculous. She compromised with her conscience by saying severely, I hope you won't have occasion to make many more such apologies. I hope you'll try to control your temper now, Anne. That wouldn't be so hard if people wouldn't twit me about my looks, said Anne with a sigh. I don't get cross about other things, but I'm so tired of being twitted about my hair, and it just makes me boil right over. Do you suppose my hair will really be a handsome auburn when I grow up? You shouldn't think so much about your looks, Anne. I'm afraid you are a very vain little girl. How can I be vain when I know I'm homely? Protested Anne. I love pretty things, and I hate to look in the glass and see something that isn't pretty. It makes me feel so sorrowful. Just as I feel when I look at any ugly thing. I pity it because it isn't beautiful. Handsome is as handsome does, quoted Marilla. I've had that said to me before, but I have my doubts about it, remarked skeptical Anne, sniffing at her narcissi. Narcissi? Narcissi? Is it I or narcissi? CISSI. Narcissism, obviously. That didn't answer my question. American versus... Is it pronounced differently? I'm going to just say narcissi, because they're referring to the flower, specifically. So plural of the flower. Anne, sniffing at her narcissi. Oh, aren't these flowers sweet? It was lovely of Mrs. Lynde to give them to me. I have no hard feelings against Mrs. Lynde now. It gives you a lovely, comfortable feeling to apologize and be forgiven, doesn't it? Latin plural. True. Aren't the stars bright tonight? If you could live in a star, which one would you pick? I'd like that lovely clear big one away over there above the dark hill. Anne, do hold your tongue, said Marilla, thoroughly worn out, trying to follow the gyrations of Anne's thoughts. Anne said no more until they turned into their own lane. A little gypsy wind came down it to meet them, laden with the spicy perfume of young dew-wet ferns. Far up in the shadows, a cheerful light gleamed out through the trees from the kitchen at Green Gables. Anne suddenly came close to Marilla and slipped her hand into the older woman's hard palm. It's lovely to be going home and know it's home, she said. I love Green Gables already, and I never loved any place before. No place ever seemed like home. Oh, Marilla, I'm so happy. I could pray right now and not find it a bit hard. Something warm and pleasant welled up in Marilla's heart at touch of that thin little hand in her own, a throb of the maternity she had missed, perhaps. Its very unaccustomedness and sweetness disturbed her. She hastened to restore her sensations to their normal calm by inculcating a moral. If you'll be a good girl, you'll always be happy, Anne, and you should never find it hard to say your prayers. Saying one's prayers isn't exactly the same thing as praying, said Anne meditatively, but I'm going to imagine that I'm the wind that is blowing up there in those treetops. When I get tired of the trees, I'll imagine I'm gently waving down here in the ferns, and then I'll fly over to Mrs. Lynde's garden and set the flowers dancing. And then I'll go with one great swoop over the clover field, and then I'll blow over the lake of shining waters and ripple it all up into the little sparkling waves. Oh, there's so much scope for imagination in a wind. So I'll not talk any more just now, Marilla. Thanks be to goodness for that, breathed Marilla in a devout relief. Poor Marilla. That is a very precocious child with an amazing imagination. Um, totally she just slipped the insult right by. I cannot, and just passed it right through the apology. And Mrs. Rachel Lynde just right over her head. Absolutely did not catch it. And, and Marilla's just like, no, you didn't. Just, oh, it's so funny. Okay. It is now another hour past, and I feel like 8 chapters was pretty good. That's a solid run. Let's find somebody lovely to go visit. And we will. It was a good run, especially after last week. I don't know. I got work related stuff and I got, twisted up and just kind of burnt out. So it was good to take some time off. Let's see. Who is available to say hello? A lot of people playing the Sucker for Love game. I don't know anything about it. I would like to go visit Curious. It is their birthday-a-thon, and it is Autism Awareness Month, so I think that would be very supportive. You're very welcome, Valen. Let's go support our friend here. Let's go visit Curious. It's been a minute since we've raided Curious, too. Curious. Curious. One. Okay, I forgot. The Curious. There they are. Okay. All right, all aboard the raid train. Choo choo. What should we say? Now leaving the library. And then the little, gosh, I've got the little raid thing, and we'll just copy that a few times. Da 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 da. There we go. That shall be it. Ta-da! Okay, so copy the raid message if you would please. All of you lovely followers, Librophiles, have access to that emote, and that will never change. I think it's nice to have something to raid out with that anybody can use. Okay, let's go raid Curious. And say hello and happy belated birthday. All aboard. Choo choo. Let's go say hi.